Thank you, friends, colleagues, for joining today. It is a blessing and a privilege to be with you. Some of your faces I recognize in names. It is great to see you as well. If you will allow me, there was a colleague who had participated in a number of seminars over the years that I was privileged to lead, who was planning to be a part of this gathering today. His name is the Reverend Dr. Chris Zanikis, who unfortunately passed away recently. So I was saddened to hear from his lifelong friend, partner, Susan Fast, who I think is also with us. I know some of you may have met him. Most of you may not have know him at all. But I'm asking you, would you just please let us have a moment of a few seconds of silence in memory of him, and there might be others in your life that you would also want to recall in this moment of silence. So let us be in silence. Creator God, we give you thanks for the capacity to gather even in this virtual way. Let our being together be a blessing to our work and our time together. We remember Chris and others in our lives who enriched our paths, who spoke of a witness of love and justice in the world. Help us to embrace this day for the gift that it is. In Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thank you all. So, clergy well-being during a time of uncertainty, a report from the trenches. So our introductory statement is one that says, being healers in a wounded world is not easy. Clergy self-care and pastoral actions stemming from a broader sense of wellness are critical now more than ever. So here is an operating definition of self-care. Some of this, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. But the definition of self-care is often descriptive of a medical and cognitive scientific ways of how we understand and deal with our emotional and physical needs. It is often individually situated. Some of the benefits of self-care from a medical perspective includes the management and reduction of stress, a general increase in good physical health. Medical recommendations and conceptions of self-care imply or shy away from, including a robust view of spirituality as an important part of the self-care matrix or holistic approach to self-care. So self-care is defined as the daily process of being aware of and attending to one's basic physiological and emotional needs, including the shaping of one's daily routine, relationships, and environment as needed to promote self-care. Mindful self-care addresses self-care and adds to the component of mindful awareness. Mindful self-care is seen as the foundational work required for physical and emotional well-being. Self-care is associated with positive physical health, emotional well-being, and mental health. Steady and intentional practice of mindful self-care is seen as protective by preventing the onset of mental health symptoms, job, school burnout, and improving work and school productivity. But I want to bring to mind the work of Hessel around pastoral care and counseling, where he talks about frameworks of stories. That is, pastoral care is about listening to stories, addressing systems that people are operating in, and of course ourselves. So his notion that self-care is a theological act captures the value of understanding self-care from a theological standpoint. A spiritual life helps us to remain connected with our sense of God, one another, and nurtures a healthy worldview and regulates the impact of demands and stress in our lives. Prayer, meditation, being a member of a faith community, group Bible study, and engaging in the rituals of the church and keeping a Sabbath day, caring for others are some of the ways we care for ourselves. Now, research supports that from a theological perspective, the practices like prayer, worship, and other activities deemed sacred by the clergy, in addition to the self-care and mindfulness engagements, contributes to the clergy's sense of being anchored by faith and deepens their felt relationship with God. These religious practices contribute to the clergy's discernment and insights when reflecting on Scripture, used when teaching Bible study and preaching, for example. And the clergy's sense of calling is enriched, from which they derive an increased sense of agency that enables them to imagine and do the work they feel called to do. And so I got interested in these kinds of issues and developed this study called How Are You Being? Clergy Self-Care During a Time of Anxiety and Uncertainty, a study of mindful self-care practices and well-being amongst clergy, with looking at implications for the church and its future leadership. Now, this arose, my interest in this arose out of my experiences during the pandemic, the acute phases of the pandemic, and needing to step back and refresh myself. I was fortunate to receive a pastoral study grant from the Louisville Institute. And this was the proposal that came out of it, and then the subsequent work and publication. So invitations were sent in the spring to 1,200 clergy serving in the New England area, and with a 39% response rate. 968 of the 1,100 clergy were of Southern New England Conference United Church of Christ. 103 were American Baptists, 35 Episcopalians, and 9 Presbyterians, 3 Evangelical Lutherans, and 2 United Methodists. 326 of the 445 who responded were included after the elimination of 119 incomplete surveys. I was surprised, for an example, to find that the incomplete surveys, people started and then they didn't finish, but there was no clear reason why they may have started and didn't finish. But one responded in the group focus that I'll talk about in a minute, said that a few of his colleagues who started taking the survey became so anxious and so aware of their need to engage in self-care that they just, it was provocative, so they stopped the questionnaire. Now, that's anecdotal, but it's something worth thinking about. Females in the study were in the majority, and the mean age was 59, with a range of 25 to 87. More respondents were employed part-time, that won't surprise many of you, than full-time. And the mainline Protestant denominations are known to have a high percentage of white Americans. White Americans in this study were the majority, followed by African Americans, who were represented slightly more than among the mainline denominations. The Physical Well-Being Index was created by the Mayo Clinic, and the Mindful Self-Care Scale was developed by a researcher, psychologist named Cook Catone and her colleagues. The development and validation of the Mindful Self-Care Scale and assessment of practices that support positive embodiment. So mindfulness. The Mindful Self-Care Scale is a 33-item scale that measures the self-reported frequency of behaviors that measure self-care behavior. Behaviors like going to the gym, exercising, taking walks, engaging in meditation. I mean, the list is quite extensive, but that's 33 of those items were used. The purpose of a focus group is to explore the phenomenon of a research study. Focus groups provide an opportunity to expand on data gathered previously by the researcher. So I'll share some of that in a moment. The number of focus group sessions held was 11. The number of group participants was 37. 27 focus group members identified as female. 10 focus group members identified as male. 1 identified as African American and male, and 1 as an African American female. So these were the general themes that came out of the focus group of those that I just identified. They spoke about clergy engaging in quiet quitting. Quiet quitting is being still employed, involved, carrying out the functions of your work, but doing it at the very minimum with the objective of holding on long enough to either quit or get another job or retire. There was a need for clergy mentors for self-care, according to the focus group, that the need for exemplars, people, mentors who could help them think about and engage in self-care. Pursuing reimagining wellness with clergy and church community. That is, during the pandemic and right afterwards, there was this felt need to reimagine with other clergy and the church community what their ministries were all about. There was also an emerging self-care language, a language that includes the psychology or the biomedical model, but also a theological or spiritual model. Some people in the focus group kind of bristled or wasn't clear about what self-care and mindfulness meant. They're two such popular terms, but the dominant areas where mindfulness and self-care are talked about is in the larger literature in public health and in mental health and in behavioral health. So there was also the emergence of a church post-acute COVID crisis. That is, members of the focus group felt that while the acute phase of the COVID was ending or was in the process of ending, there were still effects of it that created crises in their ministries. Continued healthcare problems and concerns with some members, debates about whether to reopen to the public or to have primarily just online church, how to continue to educate the congregation about COVID and COVID protocols should that emerge after the acute phase. Clergy were coping with racial tensions and COVID and political turmoil over the past 5 years. So that it's, we all know that there's been a lot of issues with George Floyd on and even before. Then you had COVID and then the political turmoil that we still seem to be in as a country. There was also an expression of clergy trying to think through the difference between self-care and selfishness. And one of my mantras is that self-care is not selfishness, but many clergy struggle with trying to articulate that. And some of them even said that when they tend to try to focus more on their needs, they can be seen or accused of being self-centered. And so this created, for some of them, a sense of vulnerability with their congregations. Did not want to perceive the congregation to perceive them as weak or in needs of things that the members of the congregation obviously have. So this whole idea of how they were coping with and defining vulnerability emerged in the discussions. The next thing was the relational character of self-care. That is, what is the relationship between the clergy and the congregation mirroring or reflecting what self-care looks like? And this we'll pick up a little bit later when we talk about a self-care protocol. But that was part of the discussion. And then clergy then were dealing with a lot of forms of grief and grief ministry. Now, grief, as you know, is the normal reaction to our having lost someone or something that's meaningful to us. And we know about the grief that was caused by the deaths of people during COVID. But it's that too as important as death of friends and relatives and loved ones. But it was also the grief associated with the feeling that the frameworks for being and living out ministry were being challenged and transformed so radically by the COVID pandemic that they were grieving the loss of how they understood ministry 5 years ago, let's say. So grieving a sense of identity transformation and therefore an identity loss from the previous ways of being clergy. Next, thanks. So the highlight of the findings was the mean age, I said, was 59. More respondents were employed part-time. And clergy who felt good about helping others tended to take care of themselves better and have lower risk for reducing well-being. And clergy who engaged in multiple and frequent self-care strategies experienced higher well-being than that clergy who did not engage in multiple and frequent self-care strategies. This is according to the survey results. So here are the highlighted findings, continued here. More experienced clergy appear to have refined tools for handling the pressures of giving and caring in spiritual care. Religious organizations, that is, denominations and churches, many of them have begun to recognize that the pursuit of wellness among their clergy is a win for both clergy and its members. In the spiritual care professional's journey toward wellness, mindful self-care is imperative. There's no question that to be mindful and to have an intentional plan and to engage in self-care in multiple nuanced ways every day of one's life. It's not just a matter of having a 2-week vacation or a 1-week study break. It's a way of a whole integrated approach. But engaging in that is really imperative if clergy are going to be to increase their well-being, their health, and their resilience. So denominations would benefit from promoting how more experienced clergy can assist less experienced clergy in self-care strategies and practices. You've heard that old poster that says some people have the same experience for 20 years and some people have 20 years of experience. There's a difference between just being in on a hamster road scale, just doing the same thing over and over again. But the experienced clergy, and experience was here defined more by years of service and age compared to younger clergy, had a lot to offer, but they felt that there wasn't a way in which their denomination was encouraging this kind of cross-fertilization or a communication between more experienced clergy with those who are less experienced or newer to ministry. And clergy well-being is enhanced by supportive family and other support systems. I mean, you know, we would all say, of course, that goes without saying. But not everybody's family, not everyone in ministry has a supportive family or an extended support systems that includes the church but goes beyond the church. And so this led me to further reflect and say that what is needed is a self-care protocol and a new way in which clergy and congregations need to sit down and think through what that would look like for both of them. So self-care has many dimensions that need to be integrated to create a safe, secure, and nourishing working church environment. This environment must maximize pastoral excellence by promoting self-care, science, and evidence-based knowledge linked to the system of personal and physical wellness, resilience, and the health for clergy and congregations. So promoting resilience is a key element of self-care, and resilience refers to a good adjustment across the mental, physical, and spiritual domains in the face of adversity. And the literature in general, and my experience as a person and as a pastoral counseling person, identifies with these capacities. The resilience is the ability to experience reward and motivation in a positive and optimistic way, ability to work and be productive despite fear, adaptation of social behaviors to promote altruism, social bonding, and teamwork, and the use of cognitive thinking skills to see negative experiences in a more positive light, and the development of meaning and spiritual purpose in life. So self-care must move beyond, as I referred to a moment ago, rhetorical exhortations to a concrete system of congregational policies and practices. And clergy and their congregants are in a mirroring relationship. What works for pastors and congregation can work for them both. Pastors and congregation must imagine a new mutuality of self-care. Maybe we should call it a covenant that includes but goes beyond contractual understandings of the pastor and congregational relationship that's put in the contracts, if you will, between pastors and churches. And so a broad question is, what would a healing environment of a congregation, their relationship to one another, and the pastor look like? As you think about your experiences and how you are caring for yourself or how you are challenged to do so, how is that influenced by the relationship you have with the church or the organization you're working with? And might there be some value, I think obviously that there would be, in really sitting down and teasing out what a self-care protocol or covenant would look like between you and the church or the organization you're working for, and between you and your family. This protocol could have several dimensions to it. So to the end of these general information pieces from the research and from the survey, we have developed a few questions that we'd like for you to look at, and after which we're going to come back and discuss your reaction to the questions or to any other aspect of the data that I've been presenting. So I think now you're going to be taken to the poll. So Kelly, you can let me know if the poll, if they're finished with the poll.
Looks like we're still getting some answers, Jerry.
Oh, great.
We'll give it another minute.
After you guys finish responding to the poll, I want to go back to the themes of the group session and some of the other findings and walk through that together. So in the past month, have you felt burned out from work? It's a split 50-50. Feeling down or depressed. Majority, well, 59 says no, 41 says yes. I don't see the response to number 3 yet. I had to scroll down, that's why. Okay, number 3 is in the past month, have your physical mental health? Some say yes, most say no. My work schedule leaves me enough time for my personal family life, etc. Hey, this is a healthy bunch. 71% said yes, over 29. let's see, if you were to create an agreement, your family, what would you put on it? Some say, yes, I think, let's see. 82% answered, but those answers are particular to those of you who answered it. Okay. Okay, thank you. Let's go back to the slide about the themes that came out of the focus groups. I think the next one. Okay, thank you. Within the world of practical theology, if you will, there's, and rightly so, there's this kind of pushback about relegating self-care practices and language and understanding strictly in the realm of the psychological or the medical model. That, as I indicated, there's a spiritual theological way, and as Hessel said, it's a theological act. So it's not either or, but an integration of both, and each area, that is the social science side and the theological side, have a lot to offer each other in conversation, as well as to the actual function and practicing of clergy. But I was wondering, I certainly want to hear any question you have about anything that I've presented. This is a very broad picture. Self-care practices and the meaning of it will vary according to a person's class, or how they understand their class location, their ethnicity, their understanding of gender roles. There's just so many variations that can be a part of it, that I'm fully aware of. So, any responses to some of these, or any of these findings from the general themes from the focus group that anyone would like to comment on?
Jerry, I've got a couple of questions.
Yes.
One primarily is, what differences did you observe between part-time and full-time clergy? Did part-timers score higher or lower or the same as full-timers in terms of their well-being? Are part-time workers managing their time or self-care in distinctive ways that impact their overall well-being?
No, it was part-time or full-time seemed not to be the distinguished variable about what people were doing. It was, in other words, both groups were doing similar things or not doing similar things.
Okay. Another is there any, do you want a question on quiet quitting right now, or you want to hold that?
No, go right ahead.
Okay. Is there any data on quiet quitting in terms of age, reasoning, race, geography, church size, denomination, etc.? And are there any sources of reference that would be available to folks to read?
The quiet quitting idea is more in the literature about burnout and in social science, social services. It's a language, because I asked this at least from the group. It's a language that they've adopted and kind of borrowed from those areas, but I'm not aware of any particular documentation from a denominational standpoint that explicitly talks about clergy quiet quitting. I think part of the reason is because many of the clergy who are engaging in that are keeping it, frankly, on the down low. At least that's my speculation.
Okay. One of our guests is still not understanding the emerging self-care language. Can you give an example of what that sounds like?
Yeah, the emerging self-care language, that is language that is more spiritual and theological than psychological. That while we all talk about mindfulness, and an example would be for this mindfulness, uh, the way in which people focus on a certain kind of activity like prayer, or being aware of how they're feeling, their body, all of that. Uh, you can talk about it in a social science way exclusively, or you can talk about it as a form of spiritual awareness and spiritual growth. So there's this interest in talking more about it, at least amongst clergy, from that theological spiritual side. So when you say you engage in mindfulness practices, all right, I'm intentional and focused to engage in the practice of prayer or Bible study. I might also be very intentional and mindful of how I'm feeling in any given time, or very intentional and mindful about setting aside time for exercise, taking a walk, et cetera, et cetera. But the attributes of doing that, or the consequence or the impact of doing that, is a deeper sense of oneself as a spiritual being. And the challenge is to think about what clergy do out of their sense of who they are. It's not just a matter of doing activities, it's a matter of how those activities are really reflective of a deeper sense of themselves. And so when clergy shift context or retire, and they're no longer doing clergy things, pastor things that pastors do, their sense of who they are as religious people still have to be nurtured and find other ways of being expressed, because the focus is on a deeper sense of one's identity, not just out of one's sense of functions. I hope that helps.
Okay, great. Did anyone in the focus group mention the reality of how clergy are supposed to be available? How that has dramatically changed with the advent of email and cell phones and texting and being able to call and reach somebody 24/7. General availability, pastoral or other emergencies are different, but in general, like, did this come up at all in focus groups about the kind of need to be available all the time?
Yeah, that it came up around the theme of vulnerability. That is to to put borders and boundaries on being very available requires the clergy to uh, trust in both their own instincts about care, but also to continue to educate the congregation about and respecting boundaries. Uh, to the extent that that's not done, or it's very permeable, um, clergy are still, responding and being available in those ways at the risk of feeling, depleted.
Okay. Another one that might fit in here. You mentioned that clergy are grieving the loss of how they understood ministry and personal identity 5 years ago. What's the difference now? What's the new understanding, and what did it
Sure,
replace?
sure. There are a number of ministers who before the pandemic were not oriented towards being media people. They they weren't producing sermons on Zoom and Facebook. Yeah, the whole idea of the media approach to ministry meant that they had to think about themselves in that medium, and some had to learn the technology to assist the congregation or the volunteers in the congregation to produce the weekly services. So there was a different sense of self in function. Going to church, doing a sermon, and doing other things you do with the audience of the congregation is different when it's the congregation audience and the World Wide Web audience. So now some evangelists who like Billy Graham and others of another generation, they've been into the TV stuff long time, you know. But for the average clergy person, the idea that worship is also now a production uh, impacts their sense of their role there and how they're going to be present in that medium. That's just one area of the change.
Okay. I've got a couple of other questions, but they're about a different part of the report and also about the self-care covenant. So I'll hold on to those.
No, go right ahead with
Okay.
they probably will overlap.
Okay.
Let's
Um,
keep talking.
can you say more about the relational character of self-care, the clergy and congregation dynamic? What does it actually look like in praxis?
Well, when there is when there's a I think when there's a very reflective and intentional and deep conversation between pastor and congregations about what the self-care protocol is all about, when there's some mutual understanding of that, then when pastors go on vacation or when pastors need to take time for whatever reason, when they're able to, it helps the leadership in the congregation to understand it within a larger context of care rather than, oh, he's just have to take a day off or just taking a mental health day, that kind of thing. So as as there's more reflection and discussion about the meaning of self-care mutual to the pastor and the congregation, they are educating one another about how to think of their relationship and looking for ways in which those relationships are healthily supported. And so um, there's a minister well, we all know, many of us know what happens when you preach a very deep pastoral sermon about some kind of struggle or vulnerability uh, that a person or uh, that human beings experience, preaching on Job or something like that. It is not a surprise that the next day or at the end of that service, shaking hands, you'll get people starting to talk about, oh, you were talking about me, Reverend, or I have some issues that I really need to talk about, or the next day on Monday, which is usually an off day for clergy, but the next day after Sunday, the office, people will be calling to make appointments because something has been stimulated in them. The idea is to be able to address those kind of issues without feeling guilty or shame or that there's something wrong um, with the person, or even in the case of the clergy, helps to create a better atmosphere whereby talking about spiritual self-care, mental health issues becomes more normative than as just a side topic. Does that the person asked that question? Could you say more if you'd like for me to respond more?
Okay. The focus group talked about being perceived as selfish if they try to create room for self-care. With this in mind, how would you suggest that clergy address this in creating this mutual self-care covenant with their congregation?
In a non-defensive way, by engaging them in a reflective conversation about the meaning of self-care. Not to come in just, you can begin with some definitions like the ones I've mentioned, but not to get just stuck on a conceptual idea, but to have that kind of deep conversation that requires mutual relational and vulnerability for there to be a creation of an understanding of what the self-care protocol between the pastor and the congregation would look like.
Thank you. All right.
And, you know, one time early in my ministry, maybe it's happened, something like this has happened to some of you. I was in a grocery store and there was a person behind me, and as I was being checked out, and we kind of chatted with each other, the person behind me actually thought that I got a big discount on the groceries because I was a clergy. And I said, no, I pay the same. I pay the same that you pay, you know. Um, but there are a lot of assumptions and fantasies about the quality of support and life that the clergy has that needs to be talked about. To get too deeply in some personal business, so to speak, but you have to have conversations with the appropriate people in your church, and they feel safe enough to say what are some of their assumptions and about the overall support and quality of life that the clergy have. And that means taking a little bit of a risk, because you gotta help people to understand that some of their assumptions and fantasies, like I get a big discount because I'm a clergy in the grocery store, that has to be addressed.
Yeah, yeah. Kind of along those lines, several clergy members that I've been speaking with have mentioned that the denominations are no longer resourced enough to provide the kind of pastoral support that they used to. Someone mentioned to me that in their conference, one conference minister is responsible for something like 200 churches now. So it makes it almost impossible to really have a deep personal relationship with each clergy member. Any suggestions on, how clergy can find that support elsewhere? How important are clergy peer groups for self-care and wellness right now?
Extremely important. I mean, the denominational leadership can help set the stage and send the message of valuing self-care. And I can understand why it wouldn't have necessarily an overall plan, but it could. Our denominations create all kinds of bullet points and guidelines for other kinds of ministries, environmental justice, social justice. Why can't we do the same around clergy self-care, and encourage local congregations and pastors to form supportive, not when I say support groups, I don't mean that in the strictly psychological way, but to encourage the innovation and the agency capacity of clergy to organize themselves in various groupings and to do it's like peer-to-peer support. I mean, we wouldn't have, if I may put it in this parallel way, we wouldn't have some of the best laws about driving under influence if they hadn't been for the movement of lay people, not experts in driving or medical issues of substance abuse, alcohol, or others, and like Mothers Against Drunk Driving or not. Those changes came about as a result of ordinary people identifying a problem, educating the public about what the problem is and how to address minimizing the problem. So I wouldn't wait around for the head of a denomination to hand down some kind of self-care plan. There's capacity and agency within communities, within associations, within neighborhoods where churches exist or pastors. It requires reaching out to one another, and there might be some of this going on more in a quiet way that people don't know about, because there's this concern about being perceived as vulnerable, that kind of thing. But clergy can be encouraged and celebrated for creating initiatives around this topic. You can have a workshop or something of that sort just within your congregation about self-care more broadly, not just for the clergy, but just self-care in this time of, as I'm saying, uncertainty or whatnot. You can bring in a pastoral person, as well as someone who's more on the psychology side, and talk about self-care, just like we do other topics that are important to us. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. I have one more question for you about the report. Can you expand on the anxious avoidant attachment style? The report indicated that this was an issue during the pandemic. How would you further address that as a protectorate for the future?
Uh, could the person say just a little bit more about what they're getting at in their question, if that's possible?
Hello.
Hello.
So that was my question. Um, when I mean anxious avoidant, it seems that, for example, COVID-19 is very specific, where you don't want to catch disease, but at the same time you're scared. So the person that you're interacting with is saying, I don't want to get sick. You might be sick, but I'm like really terrified because I don't really know how to address this problem. So what I noticed, especially within the churches and also within other relationships patterns, is that people are like really reaching out because they feel that I want to have the community, especially because the schools were closed, the grocery stores, the crime in the area. I want to be able to have that sense of safety, but at the same time, I don't want to get harmed. So that kind of allows for some type of like cognitive dissonance, is what they would say. I mean, we can go deeper into like DSM-5, like diagnoses about PTSD, but those situations start to become an issue
Right.
because people are like, I really want to reach out. I'm terrified, but at the same time, I don't want to get sick. So that's what I
Right.
meant about the anxious avoidant. And then how do you like protect yourself from that? Because I know masks are just very like, they just cover your face, right? They don't really protect you from the psychological harm that that kind of behavior causes for the recipient
Mhm.
as an person.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
You know, it's causing us to really think more differently and maybe deeply about the meaning of safety and what constitutes safety in relationship to one another. I think I indicated in the book that I did indicate in the book that I attended a church where the communion was handed out to people as they left in the little communion cups and the bread. The minister gave a very brief 2 or 3 sentence communion statement and reminded people to take the communion on their way out. And I asked them why were they still, this is recently, I asked them why were they still practicing that? She said, oh, we started that during COVID, but they hadn't sat down to talk about why should they continue that. And it seemed like it became even more of a convenience and a shortening of worship time. But here's the other thing about it. While people were encouraged to take communion as they left the church, during service, they had passing of the peace. Uh, that in some churches sometimes you have to worry. Passing the peace could take 20 minutes. People start talking and exchanging. I mean, it was wonderful fellowship. But I'm saying you all are talking and hugging and passing the peace, but saying that the communion is handed out at the end to minimize contact. They didn't see the contradiction. So part of what I'm saying, Gabriel, is that clergy people need to think about ways of introducing the question. Um, what would constitute for us a feeling of safety, and how do we create that so that there's room for people who want to shake hands and hug, and there's room for people who want to wear masks and stand back without creating an us and them environment. Does that make sense to what I'm saying? Okay.
Okay, that's all the questions I have for right now.
Okay, looking at the characteristics on quiet quitting, I think there's another page for them as well. Is there another slide? Oh no, yes, okay. Nope, the other way. Okay. Nope. Okay, the highlighted findings. Maybe some of you have alluded to different aspects of this. I think for me, one of the um, takeaways is number one, that there needs to be some uh, further conversations amongst clergy and congregations about what is self-care and what does it look like for the clergy and for the congregation in relationship to each other. That people with clergy with experience and who are coping well, like you, many of you scored very high about that. How do you pass on that wisdom and examples of behavior to clergy in your community, particularly younger clergy coming into ministry? I've encouraged on this side of the ledger in the academy that we need to talk more about this and integrate it in some of the ministerial formational courses in pastoral care. But denominations thirdly need to talk about it and promote self-care as a value, and can reframe it in theological, spiritual language that would be more attractive to clergy. And to avoid this false dichotomy or this assumption that the more behavioral or psychological model of understanding self-care is an enemy to spiritual understandings and promotion of self-care. The dichotomy is a false one, and they both have a lot to offer one another, as I indicated. And at the local level, church level, that is, it's going to really fall on religious leadership, the clergy, to lead the congregation in thinking about and reframing and coming up with an understanding of covenant of care between the two. In the book, I give a sample protocol of some of the features that a protocol like that would entail. But no matter what categories one comes up with to describe and to measure, it would have to be tailored to the identity, if you will, of the congregation. So, for an example, in a protocol, you would have a clergy self-care protocol. You would have a definition from the church's perspective and the pastor of what self-care is all about, and then develop the covenant language around that, and the priorities. What would be the priorities of a self-care protocol? The nature of peer support, and reminding people about the fact that being empathetic, compassionate, is important ingredients to healing. Sometimes the healing, as I call the healing environment of the congregation, sometimes congregations can intentionally or unintentionally, be so almost cruel in the ways in which it responds to people's needs and vulnerabilities. I say this as a commentary. As important as the resurrection story is, for me as a Christian person, I recognize that not everybody is at Easter. A lot of people are still at Good Friday. And when I want to jump to Good Friday and do the triumphant stuff, as important as that is, you got to have ways of talking about how you get there and what that journey looks like, rather than the end product of being at Easter, if you will. And so it falls on religious leadership to help congregations and the leadership of congregations develop a protocol with these kinds of characteristics. It includes prayer, meditation, and mindfulness, distinguishing and showing how they relate to each other. That is, the covenant would have something to say about that. Personal self-care practices, examples of what that would look like for the congregation and for the pastor, and ways of evaluating it along the way. Pastors get these annual evaluations, but it's around functions, meeting functional expectations, and sometimes uh, the success of it is very subjective to the people doing the evaluation. I'm not saying you got to do away with that kind of part of an evaluation, but the evaluation around a self-care model looks more at this notion of being rather than or being as well as doings. So a pastor, you probably know people like this. There are pastors who do very well the activities, the functions, the doings of their ministry. But in a private, vulnerable environment session, they'll tell you what they're struggling with and how they're falling apart. Or that their sense of being a called person with a vocation or a calling they're struggling with and trying to, So for better or for worse, my bias, and I was influenced to think about and integrate this approach by Howard Thurman many years ago, is that what we do at best, when it can be, should be a function of our being. And the more you get in touch with the who you are and the whose you are, what comes from that are the doings, the activities. That obviously includes the job description of the pastor, but the way the clergy person goes about doing those tasks in a mindful, spiritual way, it comes out of their sense of doing. Many years ago, I was visiting Israel, and we planted trees in a peace garden in memory of people we cared about. And I noticed one of the gardeners there whose care, he was taking care of a tree and some other flowers and whatnot, but he was so attentive and particular about what he was doing. Just watching him, you got the feeling that this man was a gardener. What he was doing was out of his sense of being a gardener, not out of his knowledge of just what a garden should look like. And I never forget that image because it seemed so graceful and so loving, the way he was going about looking at and tending to the plants and whatnot. So, for better or for worse, I'm suggesting that the way we go about attending to the things we do as pastors or religious leaders is a function of how we are paying attention to who we are in the act of doing those things. As I said, this is a framework that not everyone would embrace, or they have a different way of describing it. But for the most part, my experience around clergy for these 40-some years now is that we are a lot that have different ways of understanding, but we feel that we're being called to be some form of a witness of the love of God in the world. And that animates who we are. But yes. Other comments or questions, please.
Mary, did you want to take a look at some of the results of the final question on the poll? I think Megan might be
Yes,
able
let's
to
do
share
that,
that.
please. Thank you. Okay, let's start at the top. In the psychosocial terms, better boundaries and understanding of us versus them doesn't always include me versus you. Expectations about communication, how, when, response time, modeling from leadership around wellness practices, review of what's working and what isn't, and either discarding what isn't working or reimagining it. Add retreat weeks in addition to vacation weeks, time off, paid retreat opportunities. Grace, balance, understanding that I'm human, expectations kept in check, new ways of doing things, okay, so much. 2 days off per week rather than 1 day that usually turns into a half day. You can scroll down for it, okay. I wish I knew the specifics about availability and how and when to contact, yeah. Clarify around how self-care practices would be encouraged and supported by the congregation. Time away and tools, ability to mentally leave work at the office, boundaries to how time, space for physical exercise, clear definitions about what Sabbath time looks like in terms of physical and online presence. In my situation, I often check in with them and allow them to check in with me. Also, I try to be as fully transparent as possible. Next, we share responsibility and time off to experience much needed rest, not to feel like I'm always on call. Development of volunteer pool, boundaries for time and change language of study leave. Yep. Allocate time regularly for creative exercise. So all of these, if you will, are different ways and elements that could, in fact, um, go into your thinking about creating a protocol. I'm wondering, can these responses be sent to all of the participants on the call today?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay. Yeah, if you would send them all, and each of you can look over it, and if you have a chance to get the book, get the book. I guess I'm sound like I'm promoting it, but I do have a sample of the protocol in the book, and you can use it to play with it, or you can go to jerrystreets.org, and on my website you can click on the survey and get a sample of the protocol there as well. It doesn't have the full discussion that the book has, but the protocol example is there. So here's another feature to this. Many years ago, a friend of mine was a local pastor. We were pastoring to respective churches in our community years ago. It was during the summertime, and I went by his home. I don't know why I was going by to say something to him or whatever. But when I got there, it was like 80 degrees, and he was mowing the lawn in a suit. And I said, man, you're going to have a stroke out here, the heat stroke. Why are you mowing your lawn in your suit? He had the jacket off, but he had the shirt and tie and everything. He said, well, he was afraid that one of his members might drive by and see him, and he didn't want to look. I said, well, they're going to drive by and see you laying out in the on the street. But I appreciated his respect and his desire to be to appear the way he thought that his congregation might want to see him. But we all have to do this interior work to find our comfort zone and being comfortable with ourselves. It's not the attitude, I don't give a damn about anybody else. It's not that. It's about giving a damn about yourself, really. But to become comfortable enough in your own skin so that you can be present, not in a performative way that has its place in worship. But even in worship, even when we're performing, we want to be present authentically in the way in which we perform our work. And so that is something that each of us has to do on our, individually. Our journeys are different. We're different personalities, but the task is still the same. coming to a deep understanding of who you are and whose you are and what will nurture that understanding that then releases or gives guidance to the how that you're doing. Someone asked, is the survey local? Yes, it was New England, the New England clergy in Boston, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. Other questions or comments or thoughts?
Jerry, there was a national wellness survey of clergy, correct? Not yours, but they have done a national survey, correct?
Yes, there are several national surveys, but around how would the kind of general demographics and self-care that you might find across the helping professions, social work, nursing, that kind of thing. What I'm advocating is a more, if you will, a theological, spiritual approach to developing a covenant. But yes, there are national surveys about clergy. It was interesting that when I contacted the Mayo Clinic about their well-being, a measure that I use, it's very, very prominent in medicine with doctors and with nurses, but they had never had anyone to use the survey applying to the experience of clergy. In spite of the validity of the survey, and it's been around for, if you go to Mayo Clinic and put in wellness, you'll get a whole array of instruments and essays about well-being, but it relates to burnout in physicians and in nurses.
Do you have an example of someone who does self-care well and how they kind of stop thinking about church life when they're not working? Is there anybody that comes to mind for you, and any tricks that you can share with the group?
Well, but part of my first reaction about that is for just to encourage people to think about who strikes them as exemplars of this, and be willing to go and talk to them about your perception, and have them to respond to the extent that they feel comfortable how accurate your perception might be. So quietly sit in your own space and think about who are the people I know in my life that seem to kind of deal with this, and let me ask them, inquire more about it. That's one approach. Yes, there have been people in my own life who seem to do this well, and have affirmed that they do. And in their presence, I've always felt a nurturing spirit, if you will, and how they got there. Frankly, some of the people who are exemplars for me are at now at the place of their sense of wholeness and peace, if I can put it that way, out of some great midnights of the soul. They're at peace because of the storms they've been through. But I'm thankful that they're willing to be open enough to share that with me, because there are people who've been through that who would not want to let you know for a lot of reasons, privacy, or even some concern about how they might be perceived. But I think that what would be the most helpful, I mean, we can read books and we can read stories about people, but what might be really most helpful is to really create the space to talk to people that you know, and it can be a janitor, it could be a secretary. It doesn't have to be other clergy. It could be a teacher in your community. I had one friend who said to me, who was a physician, who worked when I did my work in Bosnia, who stayed and worked during that war, and a woman physician on top of it, which she had other kinds of risk factors happening during the war. And I asked her a couple of months ago, you know, the Bosnian Accords happened a long time ago. The country is still developing itself. You know, I said, how are you now? And she said, well, you know, Jerry, I've decided that what I needed most in my life is a cup of coffee, some roses, and a green garden, and an opportunity every now and then to sit and talk deeply with a friend. You think about that. A cup of coffee, whatever your stimulant might be, it might be tea, beauty, roses, a garden, someplace that reflects nature's beauty and aesthetics and cultivation, and conversation, relationships. I mean, there are different ways to describe it, but my guess would be if you have that enriching conversation with that one person or other people that you might reach out to, there would be some variation of what they find that really nurtures their sense of who they are and the work that they do. You know, at least that would be my speculation. But how you implement it and how you create the boundaries, no one can do that for us but ourselves, no matter what. It's what we do in relationship to the people we're working with in our congregations. Is how we choose to show up and be present with them. It's how we prepare and be present for those awkward, sometimes challenging committee meetings or board meetings or annual church meetings. You know, early in my career, I used to not sleep well the night before an annual church meeting because I always anticipated there's going to be some mess, you know, or somebody's going to bring up something that I didn't know anything about, or totally distort something that you know. So I started thinking about, reflecting on how I wanted to be emotionally present, and it's not ruminating and becoming anxious, fantasizing about the worst thing that can happen, but it's training yourself, and your emotions and your body and your spirit to have a certain kind of posture, so that when whatever comes, it comes. You see, and it takes experience and time to refine that, but it took me a while to get to a place where I didn't have to have a sleepless night before a meeting. If that makes sense to you, what I'm saying. Maybe some of you've already been through that, or you're doing that, you know. I remember, if you allow me this story, I remember, again, early in my career, I had a proposal at one of my churches, and I was so excited about it. You know, after all, I'm a YDS graduate. I know how to think through proposals and blah, 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 and all that. And I had charts and graphs and the whole bit, and brought it into the meeting, and people kind of looked at it, and yeah, kind of started looking kind of glassy-eyed, you know. And then I said, "Are there any questions?" And this old active member, who was a friend, raised their hand and said, "It won't work." I said, "What do you mean it won't work?" He said, "I don't know, but it's just something about it that it just feels to me like it won't work." That was all they had to say, right? And because of their status in the congregation, that was the end of that presentation, right? What did I learn from that? I sat down and talked with them afterwards and discovered that there were some things that if I had had that conversation, explained, gave them a chance to ruminate and gave them a chance to respond and all that, they had a completely different perception, understanding of it after we had that conversation. Eventually, I was able to get it done, but the point is, I should have done it before. But I went in with my hubris, with my sense of authority, with my sense of confidence, because of previous successful experiences with being able to present things, I miscued that. So what is my point? My point is that as you work with people in your congregations, create the space for soliciting from them, not in a political sense, but out of a deep pastoral relational sense, soliciting from them what their understandings of pastoral care would self-care would be between you and the congregation. See what kinds of fears they have about it, or fantasies, or perhaps there's been some past painful experience where they were taken advantage of by someone around a pastoral rest protocol. Who knows? I don't know. But you have to do that kind of investigation. So relationships building to ministry is what location is to the value of real estate. It's relationships, relationships, relationships.
That's great.
Someone's asked, why do you think there is not more of a difference between the self-care practice? Oh, it went off. Could you read that again for me?
Why do you think there's not more of a difference between the self-care practices of part-time and full-time clergy?
The quality of it is no difference. Where they start to differ is about how much time and how much money, difference, compensation. It's those contractual things. But the substantive experiential part of it is what has to be further mined and explored and articulated. And that, that's understandable. We all know, if you have a part-time person, some people in churches think, all right, here's the contract of a full-time, and put the numbers in, et cetera. And all they do is cut it in half if it's part-time, or a third if it's 2/3, that kind of thing. But to qualify what it really means in a more narrative way, descriptive way, is still the challenge, and even more so when you're approaching redefining in conversation with the church what a protocol of self-care will look like. And I mean, how many of you have had?
Okay, well, Jerry.
How many of you have had? I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
How many of you had the experience of somebody saying, "I don't get a month off of my job. Who's going to pay me to take a month off? I get 2 weeks of vacation, and if I don't save up, so they bring in their understanding of what this is, and sometimes it's conflictual, and sometimes the person using that example, I don't get 4 weeks for my job or 2 weeks to just go study somewhere. What they're really asking, I'm saying, suggesting that you turn the attitude or the position around and to be, what is this person really trying to understand? Because what they're sharing with me is their current understanding. And how can I help them to have a broader view of this for the larger value of the meaning of a self-care relationship? I'm not trying to convince you because I'm going to get something out of it. I'm trying to help you to understand it because the viability, the future of the church, our relationship is all part of, if you can put it in a larger banner theologically, of stewardship. We tend to think of stewardship as raising money and fixing a building or building a building and giving tithes or some portion commit. That is form of stewardship, but self-care is a part of the stewardship framework. And of course,
well, Jerry, you
can look at biblical examples of Jesus taking respites and taking time away, and understanding mindfulness is one thing, meditation is one thing, prayer is one thing. They're related, but they're not the same.